Story. I am beyond excited about this. And some of you may be wondering why the season of Sacred Story. So let me tell you some of the thought that went into it. In most Episcopal churches, yea, actually in most Christian churches, from the Sunday after Pentecost until the Sunday, Christ the King Sunday, the Sunday just before Advent, is the green season, commonly known as ordinary time. But Redeemer really doesn't do ordinary, do we? And we just took the red down, and come October, creation vestments will come up again. So for now, if there was an ordinary time, green would be it. But what we realized is that there's so much more. And what we hope to do is to begin to invite you into the amazing sacred texts and experience them as part of your own journey, just as we heard moments ago from Frank in his retelling of the creation story. We also wanted to invite you, we're a storytelling community, and I can't tell you how many times I have been moved to tears and just wonder and awe as I listen to the stories from men's journeys and women's journeys and the Transgender Day of Remembrance and Recovery Sunday and alcohol and awareness. All of these things, we hear these stories, they move me to tears, and they give me a sense of the hope and courage that is alive and well here, just as the hope and courage in the stories from the Bible. Now, I don't want you to do it now, but if you haven't already, read the inside cover of your book, because it talks about how the Bible stories were originally created and how they were told stories. The world was illiterate, and these were stories that were told, their own stories that they owned. So that's how we came to be here, and that's what I'm hoping will happen for you. Now, early on, we sent out a survey and said, pick your top Bible stories. Tell us what you think everyone should know. And I will be the first to admit that creation was my top pick. I say that because I was raised in the chapel of creation by my dad. How I got to be an Episcopalian is another story. I'll tell you that later. For now, know that I was raised in the chapel of creation. And one of the things that just gave me such pleasure was to hear the story of creation. I could see the unfurling of the cosmos. I can see the stars. I can look at Cassiopeia and say, Daddy, it's upside down tonight. And Draco and Ursa Major and Minor and Orion and his belt and the Milky Way. Remember the Milky Way when we used to be able to see it every night? And the Aurora Borealis and the cypress leaves coming up and the beautiful, beautiful, majestic redwood trees and so much more. And I could go on and on. And I knew it all to be so good. Now, I was the second of three girls and my dad's fishing partner. He taught me early and he taught me very well. And at the ripe old age of 7 years old, I entered my first fishing competition at Akron Falls State Park, about a mile away from my home. Night before, I dutifully went out and gathered up all my own night crawlers. I had a bucket, and I went down to the park to catch me a fish. And I, fishing away, pretty early, I caught one ginormous catfish. Now, lest you think this is a fish story, it's not. This is small compared to what I had. I took my catfish up to the judge to have it weighed and measured. And they said to me, oh, little girl, that's one big fish. And everybody was oohing and on over my fish. And I was really impressed. And I knew that I had to take it home to show my dad. So I put it in a bucket and I ran home, but nobody was there. And as I looked in the bucket, its gills were still moving, and I thought in my 7-year-old naivete it was still alive. So I ran it upstairs to the only bathroom in the house, and I filled the only sink in the only bathroom in the house with water, and I lovingly put my catfish in. Was about to leave to go back to the park and decided it might get hungry, so I left a dozen or so night crawlers in the sink with it and went down to see what else I could do for the day. Well, at the end of the day, I came home with the trophy for the largest catch of the day. And the other thing I came home to was the wrath of my mother. She was not particularly amused by the fact that there was now a dead catfish in her sink and night crawlers all over her bathroom. And being on the wrong side of my mother was never a good place to be, so I was very, very glad when my dad got home. And after he listened to my mother rant about this dead fish and night crawlers, he just kind of laughed, and he walked over and he took me by the hand and he said, "Come on, kid." And we went upstairs and cleaned up all the worms and got my catfish. And my dad took me down to his prized rose garden. And as he dug a hole, being very careful not to disturb the roots, he put the fish in, and together we buried it. And he told me, "You know, Colleen, it really is going to all be okay, because next season we are going to have the most amazing roses in all of town." And it was so good. I keep this catfish on my bathroom counter to remind me of that. 2 years later, I would graduate to fly fishing. I spent hours out there casting, learning how to do that just perfect. And eventually went with my dad on his overnight fishing junkets. His opinion was it was best to fish from dusk to dawn. And at the end of one particularly long night and a lot of fish, I was exhausted. 9 years old, I went up and I sat down, leaning up against a tree about 30 feet in front of my dad, who'd gone down to the river's edge to clean the catch of the night. Now, we fished in the middle of nowhere, rural New York State, and bear were a real possibility. And I remember hearing a noise over my shoulder, and I was too terrified to even let out a sound. I just, in my 9-year-old mind, imagined that my dad was going to turn around and there would be a bloody mass of clothing where Colleen once sat, and that would be the end of me. And instead, out came a young buck. And he had wonderful velvet buds. And he walked right up to me. And I mean, right up to me. And I sat there looking up at him, and I thought, the worst that'll happen is he'll run as I reached up to touch him. But instead he stood there, and I began stroking his neck. I can still feel his fur in my hand. And I just stroked and stroked for what seemed like an eternity. And I knew in that moment all of creation had been made just for me. Eventually, I remember the deer looking over its shoulder toward where my dad sat at the stream's edge, looking back at me, and then just peering off into the woods. I watched him till I couldn't see him anymore, and then I turned to my dad, who at this point in time was looking back at me. And we sat for a very long time in silence, just staring at each other. We never spoke about it. Words were totally unnecessary. I'm not 100% sure how much he saw, but I do know that it was so very good. The last time I would see my dad was a husband and 2 children later. I saw him many times in between, but the last time was then, and I went to his place on the edge of Sizersville State Forest in Pennsylvania, and he was as excited as a little kid in a candy shop. He had found something new in creation that he had never, ever seen before, and he so wanted me to see it. So we ran out onto his porch, and I was deluged with a dozen or so hummingbirds who loved to come to his feeders, and he said, no, that's not it. And we went out to his flowers, and we waited, and we waited. But the elusive hummingbird moth would never show up. When I left the next day, we promised that next time we would get to see that hummingbird moth. That was October, and 2 weeks later, I got the call that my dad had died very suddenly, very unexpectedly. That spring, Pat and I moved yet again, and early summer, I started gathering up all the things I wanted in my garden of creation. And one of them was a butterfly bush. Now, if you don't know what a butterfly bush is, take the time to smell it on your way up the steps into the parish hall. It's amazing, and it's a butterfly magnet. And as I emptied out the car of my butterfly bush and all sorts of other wonderful flowers, closed the car door, I turned around, and there on my my butterfly bush was a hummingbird moth. And I just sat down and cried and had a very, very long talk with my dad. And it was so, so good. Earlier this spring, I had the great good fortune of going to Israel. And as we wandered through the Galilee and saw what Jesus surely saw, I was just, the scripture that we just heard about even the lilies of the field, Solomon was not as glorious as the lilies of the field. And I thought to myself, that's so right. There they were, fields of poppies and lupine and iris and mustard and playful otters and beautiful birds I'd never seen before. And I knew that Jesus loved every single thing in creation, just as my dad did. And I knew I was there with them. And it was so good. You're about to get to see what happens when all of these things float around in my brain. The other thing I love is Monet, and I like nothing more than to go to MoMA and get up on the balcony and look down at that beautiful Monet from afar. And every time I see it, I see something different in it. And that's what I invite you to do as we dress the table and dress Cynthia today in these new vestments. I invite you to see what is good in there for you. I invite you to find your childhood memories. In the colors I invite you into, is that a field of lavender? Or is it iris? Is it anemone? What is it for you? Is the red, beautiful, beautiful asters? Is it a flock of cardinals? Is there a graceful deer here? What do you see in the sky? Do you see forms in the clouds like I do? Do you see the pink at night, a sailor's delight, or is it the pink of the morning, sailors take warning? What do you see? And in seeing that, and in looking for that, it's my hope you'll see something different every time. And if you do, I promise you, it will be very, very good. Thanks be to God. Amen.